The coffee was bitter that morning. October 3rd, 1943. Outside Nuremberg, Bavaria, Germany. Rain tapped steadily against the windows of our delegation's car as we approached the camp entrance. The damp had settled into my bones after weeks of traveling between inspection sites. I straightened my tie, checked that my Red Cross insignia was clearly visible, and reviewed my notes from our previous visit 6 months earlier. The German officer at the gate examined our papers with exaggerated thoroughness, a small ritual of power before granting us access to a place where he held complete authority. Behind him, the prisoner of war camp stretched out in orderly rows of barracks, surrounded by watchtowers and wire. My 36th inspection. I thought I knew what to expect. I was Dr. Jean Moreau, 42 years old, senior delegate for the International Committee of the Red Cross, tasked with inspecting prisoner of war camps throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. Before the war, I had been a professor of international law in Geneva. My research focused on the development of humanitarian protocols between nations. I believed in the sanctity of such agreements, the thin threads of civility that might hold even as the world descended into barbarism. I believed in neutrality as a sacred trust. I believed in the power of bearing witness without taking sides. The Geneva Convention of 1929 gave the International Red Cross the right to inspect prisoner of war camps and report on conditions. We documented rations, medical care, housing standards, and treatment of prisoners. We facilitated correspondence between captured soldiers and their families. We distributed relief packages. Most importantly, we served as neutral observers. Our presence intended to ensure some minimal adherence to international law, even amid the lawlessness of total war. Our neutrality was our strength and our protection. We were not judges or advocates, merely witnesses who reported what we saw. Stalag 15D outside Nuremberg held primarily British and American airmen shot down during bombing raids over Germany. Colonel Steiner, the camp commandant, greeted us with the formal courtesy that characterized most of our interactions with German officers. Welcome again, Dr. Moreau. As always, the Reich honors its obligations under the Geneva Convention. You may inspect whatever you wish. His English was excellent, his manner professional. He had been an attorney before the war, he once told me, specializing in international commerce. Now he commanded a camp holding men whose bombers had killed German civilians. The war transformed us all into versions of ourselves we might not have recognized in 1939. The inspection proceeded according to established protocol. We toured barracks, checked food provisions, interviewed prisoners selected both by the Germans and randomly by ourselves. Conditions were Spartan but broadly compliant with minimal standards, a 1E400-calorie daily ration, adequate if deteriorating medical supplies, 2 blankets per prisoner. The Allied airmen reported occasional rough treatment, but no systematic abuse. They need us alive for propaganda and prisoner exchanges, a British flight lieutenant told me quietly. The Russians aren't so lucky. He was referring, I assumed, to Soviet prisoners held in separate camps under far worse conditions. The USSR had not been a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention, a technicality the Germans used to justify treating Russian prisoners with extraordinary brutality. We had reports, not from official inspections which were not permitted for Soviet camps but from other sources, of starvation, exposure, forced labor, and mass deaths. But these were not the prisoners under my mandate. I made a note of the lieutenant's comment and continued my inspection. After completing the main tour, I requested to see the camp hospital, as was my routine. Colonel Steiner hesitated for the first time. Perhaps tomorrow would be better, he suggested. Our medical officer is off-site today and several cases of typhus have been reported. For your own safety. I'm a doctor, I reminded him, and typhus inspection is precisely why I need to visit the medical facilities. The convention is quite clear on this point. I maintained the polite but firm tone that had served me well in previous inspections. Never confrontational, always insistent on fulfilling our mandate. The colonel relented with obvious reluctance. As we walked toward the hospital barracks, I noticed unusual activity at the far end of the camp, trucks being loaded with what appeared to be filing cabinets and office equipment. Administrative reorganization, Steiner explained, following my gaze. centralizing our record-keeping. I nodded as if this was of no particular interest, though something in his manner suggested otherwise. The camp hospital was much as I expected, undersupplied but reasonably maintained. I spoke with several patients, examined the medication stocks, reviewed treatment records. As I was preparing to leave, a German orderly rushed in with a stretcher carrying a prisoner who had collapsed in the yard. In the confusion that followed, I stepped into an adjoining storage room to allow the medical team space to work. The room was filled with filing cabinets similar to those being loaded onto trucks. One cabinet had been left open, perhaps in the haste of whatever reorganization was underway. Glancing inside, I saw files labeled not with names, but with numbers. Curious, I opened one. It contained transport records, not for the Allied prisoners officially held in this camp, but for other detainees, civilians. The documents referred to special handling and resettlement in the East. One page included a manifest listing arrivals at a place called Auschwitz, with columns tracking how many were processed versus selected for labor allocation. As I read, a cold understanding washed over me. These were not prisoner of war records. They were documentation of something else entirely, something outside my official mandate but impossible to unsee. The numbers were enormous. The clinical language barely disguised the reality beneath. I had heard rumors, of course, whispers about camps that were not for prisoners of war, about the fate of Europe's Jews. But rumors were not evidence, and as a neutral observer, I had focused strictly on what fell within my purview. Now, evidence had found me. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly replaced the file, moving away from the cabinet. Colonel Steiner entered the room, his face tightening when he saw me standing near the open drawer. "This area is not part of the hospital inspection, Dr. Moreau," he said. His voice remained professional, but a new tension had entered it. "These are administrative materials scheduled for transfer to Central Command." "Of course," I replied, matching his tone. "I was merely seeking a quiet place while your medical team attended to the emergency. My inspection of the hospital facilities is complete." He studied my face, perhaps looking for some indication of what I might have seen. I maintained the neutral expression that years of diplomatic work had made second nature. After a moment, he nodded and escorted me back to the main compound. The remainder of our visit proceeded without incident, but a subtle change had occurred. Both the colonel and I were now engaged in a performance, pretending that I had not glimpsed what was never meant for Red Cross eyes. That night, in my hotel room in Nuremberg, I faced a profound dilemma. The Red Cross operated on principles of neutrality and confidentiality. We reported on conditions within our mandate, but scrupulously avoided anything that could be construed as taking sides in the conflict. Our effectiveness depended on maintaining the trust of all parties, which meant not becoming a conduit for intelligence or propaganda. What I had seen in that filing cabinet fell well outside the prisoner of war mandate that granted us access to German camps. Yet, what I had seen could not be unseen. If those documents meant what I believed they did, if the Reich was engaged in the systematic murder of civilians on an industrial scale, then neutrality itself became a moral question rather than a simple procedural one. Did humanitarian principles require bearing witness only to what I was officially permitted to see, or did they demand acknowledging evidence of crimes that might dwarf anything in modern history? I wrote my official report that night, documenting the conditions for British and American prisoners exactly as observed. I noted the adequate rations, the compliance with mail delivery requirements, the absence of systematic physical abuse. I recorded the shortage of medical supplies and the crowded barracks conditions. I wrote with the clinical precision expected of a Red Cross delegate, and I said nothing about the transport records or special handling or Auschwitz. But I also wrote a second unofficial letter, addressed to my superior in Geneva, marked personal and confidential. In it, I detailed what I had seen in that storage room and my interpretation of the documents. I wrote, "I fear we may be maintaining a rigorous neutrality within a small circle of compliance while a much larger crime unfolds beyond our mandated view. If what I glimpsed is accurate, history will ask why those who knew remained silent." Have you ever found yourself caught between institutional obligations and moral imperatives? Have you discovered evidence of wrongdoing that fell outside your official responsibility to address? Have you witnessed something that demanded action when action might violate the very principles you were sworn to uphold? Share your experience below. I need to know if others understand this impossible position. My superior's response arrived 2 weeks later as I was inspecting another camp near Dresden. It was brief and unambiguous. We understand your concern, but the ICRC's mission depends on strict adherence to our mandate and the principle of neutrality. Speculation about matters outside prisoner of war conditions, especially based on documents glimpsed without authorization, could compromise our access and our ability to help those we are permitted to help. I urge you to maintain focus on your assigned duties. He was right, of course, from an institutional perspective. The Red Cross existed to do what was possible within the constraints of international agreement, not what might be morally ideal in an unconstrained world. If we lost access to POW camps by becoming perceived as Allied intelligence assets, thousands of prisoners would lose their only connection to the outside world and whatever protection our presence provided. Yet knowing this did not ease the burden of what I had seen. I continued my inspections through the winter of 1943 and into 1944. I documented conditions with meticulous accuracy. I facilitated the delivery of Red Cross packages. I maintained cordial professional relationships with camp commandants, including Colonel Steiner when our rotation brought me back to Stalag 33 AD. I fulfilled my mandate exactly as required, but I also began to pay closer attention to details that might previously have seemed insignificant. I noted the railway sidings near certain camps where cattle cars stood empty or were being loaded with people who were clearly not prisoners of war. I recorded the smoke from distant crematorium chimneys, visible from certain inspection sites, though never acknowledged in our official tours. I listened more carefully when prisoners whispered about rumors they had heard from German guards about other camps where terrible things were happening. I included these observations in my personal journal, but not in my official reports. The journal I kept with me at all times, written in a medical shorthand that would be difficult for others to decipher. In April 1944, during an inspection of a camp in occupied Poland, I encountered a German military doctor I had known before the war at a medical conference in Zurich. Dr. Werner Keller had been a respected pediatrician. Now he wore an SS uniform and served as the camp's medical officer. After the formal inspection, he invited me to his office for coffee, a gesture of professional courtesy that was not uncommon. As we spoke of mutual acquaintances and medical developments, I carefully steered the conversation toward the camp system more broadly. One hears disturbing rumors, I said casually, about special camps for civilians, particularly Jews. As a medical professional, do you have any insight into such facilities? Keller's face changed, closing like a door. We are both men of science, Dr. Moreau, he said after a long moment, so I will speak plainly. What is happening in those places is not medicine. I requested transfer 3 times before being assigned here. He looked down at his coffee cup. There are things being done in the name of the Reich that history will judge harshly. But those judgments will fall on all of us who knew and did nothing, regardless of whether we held the syringes or merely filed the reports. I left his office shaken by the implicit confirmation of my worst fears. That night, I made a decision. I would continue my official duties exactly as mandated, maintaining the access that the Red Cross required. But I would also document, in my private capacity, everything I observed or learned about the broader camp system. I would create a record that could speak when neutrality no longer served humanity. I began to make coded notations in my journal, locations, dates, names of officials, estimated numbers. I drew maps from memory, marking railway lines and camp locations never acknowledged in official communications. In September 1944, I was granted rare access to a labor camp attached to a factory near the Czech border. While it was not officially a prisoner of war facility, the commandant had agreed to an inspection because some French military prisoners had been transferred there for industrial work, bringing it partially under Geneva Convention jurisdiction. The conditions were abysmal. Starvation rations, brutal working hours, summary executions for minor infractions. I documented everything according to protocol. As we toured the factory, I noticed a warehouse where workers were sorting enormous piles of personal possessions: eyeglasses, shoes, suitcases, even human hair. A German officer quickly directed us away, but not before I had seen enough to understand. These were the belongings of people who would not be returning to claim them, people who had been told to bring their possessions for resettlement, but who had instead been sent to their deaths. In my official report, I noted the violations regarding the French military prisoners, the inadequate food, the excessive work hours, the corporal punishment. I recommended immediate improvements and threatened to elevate the matter to higher authorities. In my private journal, I documented the warehouse of possessions and what it signified about the scale of what was happening beyond our view. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced from both east and west, the Germans began evacuating camps in frontier areas, often forcing prisoners on brutal marches toward the German interior. My inspection duties brought me into contact with these marches, columns of emaciated men trudging through winter weather, many dying along the roadside. Among them were not just prisoners of war, but also the survivors of camps I had never been permitted to inspect, civilians wearing striped uniforms with different colored patches. The distinction between what was within my mandate and what was not had collapsed as the Reich's camp system disintegrated. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, I provided my official records to Allied authorities as they gathered evidence for what would become the Nuremberg trials. But I also provided my private documentation, the journal entries, maps, and witness accounts I had compiled outside my formal duties. Some within the Red Cross leadership were displeased by this decision, viewing it as a retrospective breach of our neutrality. Others understood that there are moments when humanitarian principles transcend institutional protocol. In the years that followed, I testified at war crimes trials, identifying camp commandants I had met during inspections, confirming the authenticity of documents, describing conditions I had witnessed. I struggled with my own complicity. Had I done enough? Had my adherence to Red Cross neutrality made me a bystander to genocide? Had my official reports, with their clinical language and focus on technical compliance, helped create a false impression of German adherence to international law? I returned to teaching international law in Geneva, but my courses had changed profoundly. I no longer presented humanitarian law as a set of clear principles that could be applied with clinical precision. Instead, I taught it as a moral struggle, a constant negotiation between what institutions can achieve through compromise and what humanity demands without compromise. I taught my students that rules matter, that neutrality serves a purpose, but that there are moments when one must also answer to a higher court than institutional protocol. The International Committee of the Red Cross itself faced a reckoning after the war. In 1995, 50 years after the liberation of the camps, the organization's president publicly acknowledged that the ICRC had failed in its moral duty regarding the Holocaust. "We could have done more," he stated, "and we should have spoken out more forcefully." The admission came too late for the millions who perished, but it represented an institutional recognition of what I had felt in that storage room in 1943, that neutrality cannot be an absolute value when confronted with absolute evil. I am an old man now. The world has seen many conflicts since the one that defined my life's work. The tension between institutional constraint and moral imperative remains unresolved, not just for humanitarian organizations, but for all who work within systems that both enable and limit their ability to do good. I do not claim to have resolved this tension in my own actions. I compromised, equivocated, delayed, documented when I should perhaps have denounced. Yet documentation itself proved powerful in the end. The evidence gathered by those of us who witnessed, however imperfectly, helped ensure that what happened could not be denied or forgotten. Perhaps this is the most important lesson I learned in those dark years, that bearing witness, even when constrained by institutional caution or personal fear, creates a record that outlives those constraints. Truth documented becomes a resource for justice, even if justice arrives too late for its victims. The coffee is better now than it was that rainy morning in 1943. But some tastes linger. The bitterness of knowing what was happening beyond the limits of my mandate, the acid recognition of my own caution in the face of atrocity. The price of peace is not just paid on battlefields or in diplomatic chambers. It is paid in the conscience of every person who must choose between what is permitted and what is right, between institutional loyalty and human solidarity, between the safety of silence and the risk of speaking out. I paid that price imperfectly, incompletely, but in the ledger of my life, I can at least say this: I saw, I recorded, and eventually I spoke. In a world of calculated blindness, perhaps that is something, however insufficient it may seem against the enormity of what was lost,